The hall in Washington was not meant for moments like this, yet the city that thrived on power now trembled under its own chandeliers. Rows of polished wooden benches lined with lawmakers and journalists created a stage more than a forum. There, pens and cameras sharpened not to record truth, but to capture cracks. Leaders from Africa had flown in, their presence a reminder that history's weight was not confined to continents. Yet even as the meeting began, the air felt unsettled, whispers circling like smoke, as if everyone knew something was about to rupture. President Ibrahim Traoré sat near the front, shoulders square, his uniform plain, not adorned with unnecessary flourish. His eyes, steady and fixed, did not wander. His hands folded neatly on the desk before him, as if carved in patience. Around him the voices rose, some cutting, some mocking, as American lawmakers pressed against him with accusations veiled as questions. They spoke of his defiance of foreign interference, his refusal to bow to Western designs, his insistence on dignity for a continent long dismissed. He listened, his silence louder than their challenges, the kind of stillness that unnerved those used to being met with eagerness or apology. Cameras zoomed close, waiting for the misstep, the slip, the crack that could turn calm into anger and dignity into spectacle. None came. Instead, his stillness unsettled them more than any defense could. Then came the moment that froze the air. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned subtly toward security, her voice carried by a live microphone not meant for whispers. "Please remove him." The words sliced across the room like a blade, and for a heartbeat the world stopped breathing. A gasp surged through the benches, a chain reaction of disbelief. Journalists froze mid-sentence, pens hanging above their pads, as though ink itself had turned heavy. Security guards stiffened, eyes darting between one another, unsure if they had truly been commanded to act against a sitting president of a sovereign African state. Unthinkable. And yet the command lingered undeniable, echoing across the hall. All eyes shifted to Ibrahim. The questions burned silently. Would he erupt? Would he strike back? Would the hall collapse into chaos? Washington leaned forward, hungry for confrontation. But instead, Ibrahim leaned back. His chest rose in a slow breath, his expression unreadable, and silence swept in like a tide. It was a silence deeper than the one before, so thick even the mechanical hum of the air conditioning felt intrusive. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, calm, yet thunderous in its weight. "Why should I leave a room where truth must be spoken?" The question cut the arrogance from the air, its sharpness undeniable. Gasps turned into murmurs, and the murmurs into an unsteady hush. AOC blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected defiance without fury. She had not prepared for this. Calm that could not be dismantled, dignity so firm it could not be dragged into spectacle. Security guards remained frozen, eyes shifting toward her, awaiting further instruction. But she said nothing. Ibrahim stood, then, his frame commanding not by violence but by composure, his presence swelling without a shout. The cameras locked onto him as he stepped forward, each footfall echoing in the minds of those present as if the weight of centuries walked with him. Gasps followed his steady approach until he stopped before AOC's table. His voice carried, again, gentle yet unshakable. "Congresswoman, if you believe my presence is too heavy for this room, then perhaps it is not me who should leave, but the truth you fear to hear." The chamber rippled with murmurs. Some clapped softly, almost reverently. AOC's lips parted as though words might form, but they dissolved before reaching her tongue. In that instant she seemed diminished, not in stature, but under the weight of composure she could not match. Then Ibrahim did what none expected. He extended his hand toward her, not anger, not defiance, but peace laid open in the middle of hostility. His voice softened. Congresswoman, I come not as an enemy, but as a son of Africa, carrying the hopes of children who want only to live in dignity. If my presence troubles you, let this handshake remind you we are all human first." The hall held its breath. Her face wavered between pride and uncertainty, caught in the tension of resistance and recognition. She did not take his hand, but she did not repeat her command either. Cameras captured it, the image of an African leader extending peace where insult had been offered. A moment suspended, frozen, destined to ignite the world. What happened in that hall did not end there, because the silence that had followed his outstretched hand became the first crack in a wall built over centuries. By the time Ibrahim returned to his hotel, the air outside was already thick with voices. Camera crews stationed by the entrance, protesters gathering with handmade placards, and strangers arguing on sidewalks about what had just unfolded. It was as if the moment had been torn from the chamber and scattered across the world, refusing to stay confined within four walls. Hashtags ignited like sparks. Traore moment. Let him speak. Dignity first. Each one multiplied, crossing languages, crossing borders, finding its way onto millions of screens from Ouagadougou to Harlem, from Paris to Lagos. But behind the digital roar lay shadows far older. Narration of memory pressed in, a reminder that this was not the first time an African voice had been dismissed in a Western hall. Generations had been forced to speak in borrowed words, trimmed to fit diplomatic expectations, their truths packaged as lectures easily ignored. Behind every clipped speech was 1,000 stories left untold. Villages overlooked in aid meetings, children buried with no mention in reports, entire peoples reduced to statistics, dismissed as collateral in the chess games of global powers. The stain of systemic silencing stretched back through time. And now, under the chandeliers of Washington, it had been challenged not with fury, but with quiet defiance. Ibrahim carried these ghosts with him. He remembered the boys he had buried in shallow graves, the ones who had died believing that the world would never care about their struggle. He remembered mothers clutching fading photographs because their sons would never return. Each silence in Washington carried their echoes, each insult replayed their absence. His voice was not his alone. It was theirs pressed into his lungs. On the streets of Washington, the conflict spilled into human form. Protesters clashed with words and chants. African students held flags above their heads, their throats raw as they shouted, "Let Traore speak." Others stood firm in defense of AOC, claiming her demand had been necessary, that power must not bend to outsiders. The noise became a chorus of conviction and denial, filling sidewalks and spilling into the city's heartbeat. Inside his hotel room, Ibrahim sat at the window watching lights flicker like restless stars over the city. His face reflected in the glass looked older, weighed down, yet resolute. The phone on his desk buzzed, and he answered. A crackling line carried the voice of an elderly man from Burkina Faso. "Captain, we saw it. The whole village gathered around a tiny screen. We cried when they tried to shame you, but you stood with dignity. You showed them who we are." Before Ibrahim could reply, another voice broke in, this one smaller, trembling but determined. A child. "Papa Traore, don't let them push you away. We are proud." His throat tightened. He turned his face from the window, tears swelling, and whispered into the silence of the room, "I will never stop fighting for you. Even if I stand alone in their halls, I carry you with me." Across the city, AOC sat in her office long after her staff had gone home. Darkness pressed against the window behind her, but the replay in her mind would not dim. His hand stretched out, his calm eyes meeting hers without hostility, the weight of composure she had not matched. On her desk lay piles of letters. Many urged her to stay firm, to guard against influence, to double down. But one envelope, slipped under the door by unknown hands, shook her. The handwriting was plain, the words simple, but they pierced her. Defenses. Congresswoman, that man carries the pain of millions forgotten. Please listen before you push him away. She leaned back, covering her face, tears stinging. For the first time, she asked herself if it had been principle that guided her or the quiet arrogance of pride. The world's whispers grew louder. Reporters replayed his question. Why should I leave a room where truth must be spoken? Podcasters dissected every gesture, every pause. Online debates raged, each frame of his composure slowed, analyzed, and magnified. In Harlem, an elderly African-American man leaned close to his grandson and whispered, "Do you hear that? That is what a leader sounds like." Thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, a girl bent over her notebook, scribbling down the words she had heard in a leaked clip, why peace when anger would be easier. She underlined it twice, her eyes burning with conviction, as if writing down those words could etch them into her own destiny. It became clear that what had begun as an attempt to silence was now impossible to contain. The moment was no longer about one leader or one congresswoman. It was about dignity echoing through generations, about voices once smothered, finally finding resonance in silence turned into power. The world was listening, and for the first time in a long time, it was listening with its heart. By the third day, the ripples of that first confrontation had become a tidal wave, and Washington prepared itself for another collision. Outside the Capitol, protesters lined the streets, their voices hoarse but unbroken, banners lifted skyward, with slogans demanding dignity, justice, and truth. Inside, journalists sharpened their pens and checked their microphones, bracing for the kind of spectacle that could shift the course of public opinion. The chamber was swollen with tension, every seat taken by supporters, skeptics, and silent onlookers waiting for either fury or surrender. The air itself felt heavy, thick with anticipation, as though history had agreed to pause and lean its weight into this single hearing. Ibrahim entered quietly, a stark contrast to the noise that preceded him. His uniform carried no medals, no ostentation, only the weight of responsibility. In his breast pocket was a folded letter, edges worn from being opened too many times. His mother's shaky handwriting had steadied his resolve the night before, her words etched into his heart. Do not forget, when your father was killed, it was not the bullet that destroyed us. It was the silence of those who said nothing. Do not be silent. He pressed his fingers briefly to the pocket as he walked, reminding himself that he was not here alone, but as the voice of millions who had long been ignored. When he reached the podium, the room fell silent with such finality, it seemed no one dared even to breathe. His gaze moved slowly over the lawmakers, over the cameras, over the faces that sought weakness. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but the weight in it made each syllable heavy, immovable. I came here not to be liked, not to win applause, but to remind us of something simple. A child in Africa is not worth less than a child in America. A mother's tears in Ouagadougou are the same as a mother's tears in New York. The words lingered, undeniable, reaching into the marrow of those who heard them. Heads lowered. Some scribbled nervously in their notebooks. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet his eyes. His calm voice pressed on. If we as leaders cannot see each other as human first, then we have already failed the people who trusted us. The silence that followed was unbearable, not empty but filled with the weight of guilt, of shame, of truths long buried now standing uncovered in the light. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply placed the truth in their hands and dared them to carry it. And then the silence cracked in a way no one expected. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose to her feet. For a moment all eyes widened in confusion, expecting another cutting command, another show of defiance. But instead her hands came together in applause. Slow, deliberate, the sound echoed against the walls. Alone at first, then joined by hesitant hands, then more, until the chamber thundered, with applause that broke the walls of division. Tears traced the faces of men and women who had earlier met him with suspicion. The applause was not for politics. It was for humanity, raw and undeniable. Cameras swung wildly, capturing faces contorted with emotions too complex to hide. At the very back of the hall, a figure rose slowly with the aid of a cane. An elderly American veteran, his body bent but his spirit unbroken, lifted his trembling hand to his brow in salute. His voice cracked as he spoke, each word trembling with the weight of memory. "Sir, I fought wars I never understood. If a man like you had been in power, maybe my friends would still be alive." His voice faltered, but his salute held steady, tears blurring his eyes. The chamber, once hostile, now held its breath again, not out of defiance but reverence. Ibrahim stepped down from the podium, his steps slow but unwavering, crossing the room until he stood before the veteran. He took the man's shaking hand, lowered it gently, and drew him into an embrace. His whisper carried just far enough for the microphones to catch. "Your pain is not wasted. It has become a seed for peace." The old man's shoulders shook as he wept openly, leaning against a leader half his age but carrying twice his hope. The cameras caught everything. The embrace, the tears, the unity no speech could have staged. Within hours, the image circled the globe. Screens in Africa, America, Europe, and beyond lit up with the sight of a young African leader holding an aged American soldier in his arms. Commentators struggled for words, but the picture said more than analysis ever could. Humanity had spoken louder than politics, louder than pride, louder than silence. In that chamber once marked by arrogance, dignity had risen like a tide and swept the world into listening. After the storm, silence returned. But this silence was not the empty void of before. It was dense, layered with the weight of reflection, a silence that lived not in avoidance but in recognition. In Ouagadougou, children sat in cramped classrooms gathered around flickering screens as the video played again and again, their eyes wide as they whispered to one another with pride, "He carries us with him." In New York's crowded subway, strangers who never met before reached out and embraced after watching the clip on their phones, tears welling up at the realization that dignity had spoken louder than division. In Europe, television hosts who had once shouted over each other to score points in political debates now spoke in hushed tones, conceding on air with rare honesty, "We witnessed dignity." The storm had not ended in silence. It had ended in transformation. AOC sat at her desk that night, the city lights burning faintly behind her window, but the glow did not ease the weight pressing on her chest. Papers lay scattered across the table, headlines screaming her name alongside his, critics and supporters colliding in the public square. But when she finally stood before the cameras, her voice carried no arrogance, no sharp edges, only a humility she had rarely shown. "When I asked for President Traore to be removed, I thought I was protecting this chamber," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I was wrong. It was my pride, not my heart. His calm is not weakness. It is the strength our divided world is starving for." Those words, broadcast across continents, were not received as political retreat, but as confession, as growth. For many, her admission was not humiliation, but evidence that even power could bend before truth. Across oceans, people wept, not because a politician surrendered, but because humanity broke through the armor of politics. That same evening, Ibrahim remained quiet in his hotel room, away from the glow of the headlines and the constant requests for interviews. He stood by the window, the hum of Washington beneath him, the letter from his mother resting in his pocket like a pulse against his chest. To his closest aides, he whispered words that were never meant for microphones. If even one child believes tonight that peace is possible, then my journey here was worth it. His voice cracked as he spoke, for he knew the fight was far from finished, but this moment carried the power of a seed, and seeds grow long after storms pass. The following morning he carried that same letter back into the hall for the final session. When he reached the podium, he placed it gently in front of him, not as a prop, but as a reminder. His voice, steady but heavy with emotion, poured into the silence. A child's dream in Africa, a veteran's pain in America, a mother's tears anywhere on this earth, they are all the same. If leaders cannot protect that truth, then we do not deserve to lead. The words struck like stone against glass, cracking through indifference, shaking even those who had resisted him. The silence afterward was suffocating, the kind of stillness that carried awe instead of hostility. Then the applause erupted, not polite or hesitant, but thunderous, rising like a tide that refused to be stopped. The walls themselves seemed to tremble. Cameras spun in every direction to capture the sight that no one had imagined just days before. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood, tears glistening as she clapped with both hands, not for politics, but for humanity. At the back, the old veteran rose, once more with his cane, his arm trembling, but resolute as he saluted. And in the frame captured by countless cameras stood the trinity of a moment the world would never forget. A humbled congresswoman, a broken soldier saluting with pride, and a young African president standing not in triumph, but in quiet, unshakable strength. By nightfall, the video swept the globe, but it did not go viral for outrage or spectacle. It went viral because, for once, humanity had overshadowed power. Families replayed it at dinner tables, teachers showed it in classrooms, and strangers online shared it with tears in their eyes. They did not debate what was said. They felt it. In villages across Burkina Faso, children shouted his name, waving flags under the hot sun, while in cities across America, people paused in subways and coffee shops, whispering that something rare had broken through politics and touched them. And so, as the world carried the image, the narration lingered softly like a closing hymn. Empathy had triumphed where arrogance had failed, and dignity had been louder than any insult. Ibrahim Traoré, in his calm voice that never sought applause, had become the vessel of a message larger than himself. Across continents, across screens, his words remained suspended, unforgettable. I carry them with me, always.